very much, and good to see you. I thought, since we're talking about, in many ways, the impact of inquiries, and I'm using the term inquiries pretty broadly, which I'll define, I thought a bit of history would be good. And because one of the messages, if you're going to set up an inquiry, please be careful what you set up sometimes, from time to time. So we're going to go back to the 17th century, and James VI of Scotland in 1603 became James I of England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland, and also I think claimed France at the time as well. And now James, governments come to power often with lots of ideas, one big idea or sometimes no ideas. James's big idea was to unite politically England and Scotland. Although he was king of both kingdoms, Scotland had its own parliament, has its own law, and they weren't very keen in getting together with England. Scotland, by the way, was never conquered. Scotland agreed sometime later to join with England because they were broke, basically. So James came down, and how he got there, by the way, you can thank Margaret Tudor, the older sister of Henry VIII, who married into the Stuart family. That's how it all happened. Came down, and his big idea was to unite politically England and Scotland. And James was a very well-educated person and used to make long speeches, 2 hours or 3 hours at a time. Parliament was very respectful. They got this new king from Scotland. He's got a Scottish accent and so on. And he was trying to be respectful of Parliament and so on. So he went and addressed Parliament with his big idea about uniting the two kingdoms together. And they said, look, great idea, King. It's really fantastic. Why don't you set up an inquiry? Fantastic. And he set up an inquiry. Meanwhile, he brought the Scottish St Andrew's flag and the St George flag, and this is how we got the Union Jack, okay, named after King James. The inquiry, Parliament sort of got into it. It took a couple of years for the inquiry to report. So that's one of the dangers about setting up an inquiry. You never know how long they're going to last, okay. Now, surprise, surprise, the English weren't very keen on getting together with Scotland, and Scotland certainly wasn't very keen about getting together with England. And the inquiry dragged on, and James used to write letters to them and so on, and they eventually came out and said, look, it's a fantastic idea, but its time hasn't come yet, right? So first lesson, just be careful what you do. The second one, and I had to find a John Howard connection. Now, you may not know it, but there was a very famous Royal Commission set up in Australia in 1925 into health, Royal Commission of Health, by the Bruce Nationalist government, coalition government. And the person who got behind that was a guy called, wait for it, Dr. John Howard Cumston, okay? He was the chief quarantine officer during the 1919 pandemic. He was the one who convinced Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister, to set up the Commonwealth Department of Health in 1921 because the states and the Commonwealth could never agree on anything over managing the pandemic. So the Commonwealth, of no constitutional powers, set up the Commonwealth Department of Health in 1921. Billy Hughes got rolled, as you know, because after the 1922 December election, the National Party, or the Country Party, said, we'd like to come into coalition, you need us, but you've got to get rid of Mr Hughes, okay? He's got to go. And that's how he got Stanley Bruce as the Prime Minister. Stanley Bruce had been the Treasurer. Now, by this time, John Howard Cumston had become the head of the Department of Health, right? So it's his idea, and he's become the head of the department. He gets to talk to Bruce and says, we've really got to do something, Prime Minister, about getting better coordination in the health game. And Bruce was sort of, appealed to Bruce quite a lot, and they convened a meeting of federal state ministers on health and the Prime Minister, and guess what? They couldn't get any agreement on anything, right? So Bruce said to Dr. Howard, what should we do? You need a Royal Commission, right? So a Royal Commission was set up. And this is an interesting one because it was largely constituted by doctors, that is experts. Bruce said it must include a woman. This is the first woman on a Royal Commission in Australia I can track down. Her name was Dr. Jean Gregg. She was a doctor from Melbourne, was on just about every committee on everything that could be. She made a very big difference. This Royal Commission, and we're talking about impact, this Royal Commission, and by the way, John Howard OM was a witness. He wrote the terms of reference. He was also a witness before the inquiry, and there's also evidence to show that he gave them the questions to ask him, right? So it would come up with the right answers, okay? This is ideal. This is ideal. Don't tell Queensland this, please. So this Royal Commission was really important because it tackled a whole range of issues. It tackled sexually transmitted diseases, which a lot of post-World War I had become a problem. It tackled policy coordination across Australia. It tackled tropical health. It tackled children's well-being and welfare. And they went all over Australia and they produced a report in 1926. And although the report initially had low impact, and it had a lot of problems because we had the Depression, slowed things down, we set up the Institute of Tropical Health. We started actually advertising programs on Victorian railways about VD disease, okay? Strongly opposed by the churches and things like that. We started talking about maternal health and well-being. We started worrying about, was the money that got being spent appropriately? We started having education, we started having health council meetings, became the normal of the federal and state. So over years, and what really, of course, was very important is John Howard OM, he remained head of the Department of Health from 921 to 945. There's continuity for you, and there's organisational memory for you, and there's commitment for you. So although it had a slow start, although it was resisted by the states, so many things were done. We set up a health officer in London to look after Australians who were over in London at the time. So many things were done about vaccination, reporting mechanisms, TB, and so on, all came from this Royal Commission. So I thought it's not a lost cause, is part of the thing I'm trying to say. Okay, so I thought it sort of set the scene about impact. And my next thing is, what I want to talk about this morning is what are public inquiries, types of inquiries, issues affecting their impact, and how governments sort of record. And there's a lot of confusion about inquiries. A lot of people think Royal Commissions are the only form of inquiry. They're just a minority of a type of inquiry. Inquiries are these ad hoc, temporary bodies appointed by executive government, not appointed by other agencies, but by executive government. A minister or cabinet appoint a public inquiry. So they can be Royal Commissions, committees, inquiries, reviews, and so on. They are not parliamentary committees. Parliamentary committees are partisan. Sorry to all you politicians, but we want something more independent than that. They're not permanent advisory bodies. You may have heard that there's been an inquiry set up to look at COVID, supported by 3 charity organisations, chaired by Peter Shergold. This is not a public inquiry, okay? This is not, it has no power. Its evidence will not be made public. It's not a public inquiry. And the other thing about public inquiries is that they only can make recommendations, and they are not judicial inquiries. There is no such thing as a judicial inquiry. The judiciary do not initiate and run inquiries. Some members of the judiciary get appointed, some former members get appointed. In Australia, we've got a predilection against it, especially at the federal level. So that's what we're talking about. And there are 2 types of inquiries: statutory inquiries. These are based out of their own legislation. We have the Royal Commissions Act, one of the first acts passed by federated parliament. State governments had that, the colonial governments had them beforehand. All state governments now have some form of acts around this matter. Victoria has a new Inquiries Act 2014. South Australia is moving to the same model. based on the Australian Law Reform Commission report of 2009. And then we have a whole stack of other inquiries which, like reviews and things, which have no power for anything, right? The advantage of having something under statute, if you defame someone, you get protected. That's one thing. The non-statutory inquiries, which you see, you know, the Gonski school funding model, reviews into financial deregulation, reviews into education programs, these are non-statutory inquiries. They have no power on anything at all. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. This is the beast we're talking about. And I thought I'd just talk about some of the cliches about inquiries. They are appointed much for digging things in as for digging things up, okay? A willful waste of public money and private time, Ross Gittins, I disagree with him. Never appoint an inquiry unless you know the results. Appoint the right chair to get the right answer. Used to delay things, to kick things into the long grass. Designed to get politicians off the hook. This is the cliches about inquiries. This last one is a quote. This is about an inquiry set up during the Howard government into regional telecommunications. A very cynical comment, as you can see, from one of the people who gave evidence to the inquiry. Okay. Now, there's two issues about inquiries. There's two big issues about inquiries. Why do government appoint them when they've got public service, ministerial minders, permanent advisory bodies? Second issue, what happens to them? So you're the cliches type argument. So these are two issues. So these are related issues in a sense, because if a government's appointed inquiry for politically expedient reasons to get someone off the hook or to show that they're concerned about something when they're really not, then how do you measure impact, right? Okay, that's right. And we never really know. We really never really know why governments appoint inquiries, because they do it behind closed doors, okay? Now, no government's going to get up and say, we're doing this to give us some breathing time. We're doing this because we don't know what to do. We're doing this because we want to show our concern and caring and love and so on and so forth. No government will do that. So it's sometimes a bit hard to evaluate inquiries on that basis. And impact, some issues about impact, is direct impact immediately, or is it something which filters through to the political system? Government accepting an inquiry recommendation, is that really meaningful? We accept all the inquiries. By the way, in Victoria, the Andrews government has accepted inquiry reports before they've been made. Now, I think that's quite an achievement. We did have Mr Ahern in Queensland and the Fitzgerald inquiry accepting it lock, stock and barrel before the Fitzgerald report came out. But Andrews is even accepting the reports before they've even been released. Also, what time frame? The example of the Health Royal Commission I was trying to point out is often a long time. These things filter through. So we need to be careful before we say, oh, that was a waste of time. Inquiries have a very interesting way of staying in the organisational memory or the stakeholders' memory or some academic's memory or something. They'll keep putting it up and so on. So, and there's some issues to worry about. Now, I'll just put up here very quickly, here are the different reasons governments appoint inquiries. There's what I call legitimate rational reasons on one side and sort of politically expedient reasons on the other side. If you're in the cynical camp, you'll be in the red. If you're in the rational camp, you'll be more on the other side. Now, you can see that if you've got these two different, and as often inquiries are a mixture of both. They're a mixture of government wanting to get something done, but also to get some sort of answer. And I'll be talking about some of those examples as we go on. And I think there's a tension in inquiries all the time between what I call cold advice and hot politics. So when you work in a ministerial office, it's hot politics. Cold, reasoned advice, which we hope the public service does, will be that side. And we've got this competition between these two quite different competing activities going on. Hopefully, you try to have some cold reasoned advice in with your hot politics. But I think sometimes, thanks to the media, we're veering more and more to the hot politics side of things over and over. Okay, so some challenges in assessing impacts. What was the motivation in appointment? Was it politically? Was it to get an answer? Was it to give someone a job? Or what? That's the reason. That will affect how you assess impact. Distinguish, as I said before, between acceptance and implementation. We accept all the recommendations, but were they implemented? There's a big distinction between those things. Governments have all sorts of management techniques, which I'll talk about later, about inquiry. So be careful of activity after inquiry. Doesn't necessarily mean it's being implemented. The sort of instrumental enlightenment view is this inquiry feeding into the system, discussing things. There's multiple criteria how you assess impact. And the Royal Commission on Health, long-term impacts. First 5 years you could say was a flop, but later on, very important. And also, the other thing is not all inquiry reports are good. Just because it's an inquiry report doesn't necessarily mean it's good. Just because it's a Royal Commission report doesn't mean it's necessarily good. It could be a lousy one, okay? Right? They vary. So, some key factors. What really determines, did the government really want it? If the government really wants an inquiry, it will have more impact. Did it attract any controversy and public attention? Therefore, government is often wants to respond to it. Was the report any good? Okay, did it give recommendations in the public interest? Or was it poorly put together, poor methodology? Where does it fit in the political inquiry leadership? Did the inquiry leadership, how effective were they? Did they go out and promote the recommendations or what? Did they take any active role or did they just leave it? That will affect things. Political environment. It might be a good report, but it might be coming at a time when the government's facing other problems or facing an election or a Prime Minister has changed or something like that may have happened. And the other thing about inquiries, in public policy, no area of issue is in one single zone. You often need to depend on other departments and things. And for people who don't know what a federal system is, and we've all just seen this, you might have to depend on a mob called the states to implement your inquiry, okay? So the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, it's all about what happens in prisons. Who runs prisons? States run prisons, okay? So you've got to be aware that the whole stack of things can make these things rather important in doing these things. Okay, and just quickly, beware of government strategies. Governments have all sorts of interesting ways to manage inquiries, to give you the illusion that it's been implemented. And they can fix the terms of reference to make sure the inquiry doesn't investigate much. They can preempt it by saying we're already doing it. Peter Beattie did this all the time. They can accept it, we're doing it. They can set up lots of committees afterwards to look after it. They can delay responses. The Turnbull government took 2 years to respond to, Morrison government took 2 years to respond to the nursing education review. I can never understand why. They can ignore them, they can attack them, they can hijack them for other purposes, reinterpret them, if you like. And lastly, before I get on to looking at Howard government, just remember, public inquiries are temporary. The sponsors are temporary. Ministers move on and out. Governments change. There's lots of inquiries appointed by one government, report to another. The Asprey tax inquiry appointed by the McMahon government reported to the Whitlam government. Henderson inquiry into poverty, the same. The Coombs Royal Commission into Australian Government Administration appointed by Mr Whitlam reported to Mr Fraser. No love lost there. They're reporting to an environment of permanent people, you know, permanent bureaucracy, permanent officers, stakeholders. So they're very transitory in the world. They only make recommendations, and the issue they may have been appointed to, governments lose interest in issues amazingly quick. you'd be surprised just how quickly they do. Okay, so what did the Howard government do? Here's a bit of a summary of the 88 inquiries the Howard government appointed. And I won't go any more into that detail. Here's all the details will be in the chapter. So Howard government appointed 4 royal commissions, and interesting, we had an equine influenza inquiry, but we don't have one on COVID. So what happened to some of these royal commissions? Now, this work here belongs to Alistair Stark, a Scotsman at the University of Queensland, who's got an ARC grant on this matter. And here's some of the examples. The HIH Royal Commission had 61 recommendations. 59% were implemented. Some people are critical of the direction that Royal Commission went. So you could say that had a reasonably successful impact. The Royal Commission into Building and Construction had 212 recommendations, and only 38% were implemented, but many of these were into pretty important areas and did make a difference, leading to new institutional arrangements. The Centenary House Royal Commission, which was seen to be getting back at the previous government a bit, didn't seem to have much major impact. It made some important comments and findings, but didn't seem to have much major impact. The AWB Royal Commission only had 5 recommendations. All were accepted by the government. It's highly criticised by some who saw it as led by Terence Cole, a black letter sort of lawyer, as letting the government off the hook. It did lead to some important changes about things. And then the equine influenza inquiry, which reported to the Rudd government, all its recommendations were accepted. So there's some examples of royal commissions. And I'll quickly just go on to other types of inquiries, which these are these policy ones without any particular statutory legislation. The Howard government appointed the National Commission of Audit, and Howard in his autobiography says it had a lot of controversial recommendations, and it seemed to have been largely not followed very much. The inquiry into the financial system, the Wallace Review, was basically a follow-up to the Campbell report and the Martin report, and it was very successful. It basically retuned the system a bit, kept financial deregulation going, so very, very important sort of inquiry. The Small Business Deregulation Task Force was an election promise. It was not seen to have a big impact. The small business lobby were not that impressed with it. The review of higher education, this is the West Review, it's a very interesting one. Everything it made reasonable recommendations, but the government never made a response to it. Brendan Nelson, when he became Education Minister later on, did some other things with it. The Turnbull government did a review of all reviews into higher education, and it was seen to have had quite a bit of impact in the thinking of subsequent inquiries, but for some reason or other, that's one that just seemed to be ignored, and I've never been able to quite find out why, and Brendan Nelson was never able to sort of explain it to me. Now, here's an inquiry which I think is really important. Senator Alston, who's here today, was the person who helped appoint it. This is the Major Performing Arts Inquiry headed by Helen Nugent. This is my ideal inquiry. This is a fantastic inquiry. It was about trying to get coordination across the federal government and states, extra money. It was politically an area where the coalition governments normally don't get much political credibility and so on. And Helen Nugent was a superb choice of heading this inquiry. They went everywhere, and because she was who she was, a very credible lawyer person and of some gravitas, she was able to have a bit of biffo with some of the state ministers and so on, which no public servant could, and get agreement and say, you know, stop all this nonsense. It consulted widely, it produced an excellent report, it informed the minister what was going on, it got extra funding in this area, and was importantly implemented. So I regard this as a very successful example, and she headed subsequent inquiries, And there were several other inquiries into the arts under the Howard government, which were also fairly successful and a bit surprising. The other inquiry, which also gets to Guernsey, and we've heard from this speaker at previous conferences, is the Welfare Reference Group by McClure. 7 people on it. He was from Mission Australia. He complained a bit that it was fully agreed. He also went and spoke to the opposition, got their support. It was a bit slow in getting implemented and so on, but you could say it was fairly successful. So there's some policy inquiries which have been really successful. And I'll just finish up with a couple of summaries about Howard government. Is basically, you could say the Howard government didn't have a grand plan about how to use inquiries. But, you know, and no government really does. They're an ad hoc sort of thing. Whitlam tried to explain he had a rationale, but I think it was post-inquiry rationale. A few inquiries were not appointed. They were promised. And I think what really important is only 4 Royal Commissions. We've now had 8 Royal Commissions under the coalition government who just lost office. Now, I think this is really important. The big successes of the Howard government, GST, Industrial Relations Reform, Mark 1, and other areas, there were no inquiries. Maximilian Walsh recommended that Howard should appoint an inquiry into the GST before the 1998 election or something. He didn't do that. There were lots of discussions, but I find that rather interesting. There were a lot of the policy inquiries were successful, and some were politically expedient, but so what? What's new about that? And overall, I think the Howard government used inquiries fairly effectively. They didn't seem to be overpopulated with partisan appointments, and a lot of them were taken quite seriously in the life of the government. So thank you.